Okay, well, I echo Poppy's thanks in saying thank you for turning up on a Sunday morning. It's lovely to see so many people here, and thank you to Annalisa for hosting our event as well. So these two key questions really in chapter 2 that we address, and I'll talk about some of it now as well. Before I dive into that though, kind of why me? So as a class teacher and school leader, I've supported children and families with the death of a loved one. And in my first experience, I'll be honest, I'd been teaching a little while, but I felt a bit lost at sea. And I thought, crikey, how do I do this? What do I say? As many people will, actually. There was a lot to navigate and little time to do it. As a busy teacher, you're trying to look after all the children in your care, you're marking the books, you're meeting with parents, and I had a really lovely and supportive governor who said, oh, how about this charity Seesaw, which was local to where I was working at the time. Marie, you'll perhaps be, somebody else was in Oxfordshire, be familiar with them, and some books she gave me. I thought, how am I supposed to read all of this now when we're in the middle of this crisis? And that's one of the reasons that I hope that our book will be preparation for something that is sadly inevitable for all of us. And those facts that Annalisa shared at the beginning, 1 in 16 children will lose a loved one, or a loved one will die at some point during their time in school. So I'm hoping that it will be used not just in the crisis moments, but also in preparation. So later on, I also helped 2 other children, and my own personal experiences of grief and the experiences I'd had early on of supporting that child, I felt more confident really in helping the class to use the correct terminology. The child was desperate to get up and speak. Can I talk about mum? Can I talk? Yes, absolutely. Well, mum's going to be burnt on Thursday. And I said, yes, technically you are right, but we use the term cremated. So everybody is, okay. Can I go to the party? He said that they're having a party. I said, well, yes, it is a sort of party, but it's more about people who've travelled a long distance. So we tend to provide food for those people, and it's time for people to chat and remember his mum. So, you know, it's not really a party that we're going to have music and pass the parcel. So helping them to understand the terminology in a way that they could really get it. And a dear friend of mine had 2 daughters, the eldest of whom had something called Edwards syndrome. So we knew that her life was going to be limited, but sadly we all contracted COVID around the same time. She had scoliosis, so curvature of the spine, so her lungs were already compromised, and sadly she did die from COVID. And her sister was left, so she was only 10 years old when she died. And her sister at the time, Dave, am I right, she was 7, 8 years old. And she was grieving. The mother had been into school and said, look, this is going to happen. She's got a life-limiting condition. Can you support her? They brought her pets so that they could go through the cycle of pets dying, so that it wasn't a brand new experience when her sister died. But sadly, the school didn't have a lot of input. And that was despite the numerous conversations that her mother had had in preparation. Time, finances, available staff and appropriate training were all reasons that the school cited. And they are challenges, but they don't need to be. And our book is a practical way to help to see that actually you don't need specific training. Additional training is helpful, and we have some people here today to talk about that. But actually, we can, each and every one of us, just #say something. It was those combined factors that led me to write this book. And I knew I couldn't do it on my own. And actually, I'd reviewed a book by Poppy and Marie. And in reading their book, I thought, oh, these are people who are really compassionate, really get it, really on my wavelength. And I think you talked about death and bereavement in that particular book. So I approached them thinking they said, no, not interested. Would you like to co-author a book with me? Absolutely, they said. Yeah. So that was brilliant. That's how it happened. And we only met for the first time today, which seems really random. We've communicated online. Isn't that a wonderful thing? But what we want is for all staff to feel prepared to talk confidently about death. And we want bereaved children to feel supported, unlike getting your photo out and sitting quietly and crying and nobody knowing what to say to you. That's what we want in the immediate aftermath of the death, and also throughout their time in primary school. So I come back to the difference between grief and bereavement. So bereavement is grief that involves the death of a loved one. And it's that our book will mostly focus on, enabling school staff and other adults to support children through the painful life event. And Jill Halfpenny, many of you will know from EastEnders, that's certainly how I know her, in her interview with Claire MacDonald for BBC Radio 4 Women's Hour, talking about supporting others in grief, said, if you can give them your time and you can listen without trying to fix them, that's hard, that is gold dust. It's by showing compassion for emotional expression, whether that's tears, anger, or seemingly unrelated behavioural changes, making space for grief alongside daily routines and joyous moments, and we'll talk about puddle jumping a bit later, and supporting an age-appropriate understanding of death that we can help bereaved children. We hope that our book will offer readers the confidence to sprinkle that gold dust in dark times. I hope this book will serve, as I said, as a long-term resource so that staff feel prepared in advance of childhood bereavement and bereaved children feel well supported in the immediate aftermath of the death and throughout their time in primary school. You know, anniversaries, birthdays, special times, Christmas, Mother's Day, Father's Day. I hope it will serve as a tool in the midst of a crisis. Quick, turn to chapter 14. Here are all our people that we can call. There's an email, phone them, just phone them, ask the question, yeah? I hope that it will serve both of those things and it will signpost to useful texts and organisations. So you may have heard of the Kubler-Ross grief model. And people think, okay, these are the stages of grief. And I know Poppy talks more about this in, I think it was chapter 4, where you go into a bit more detail about the different models. But this is the Kubler-Ross model. Oh yes, okay, so they've now gone through anger, they're in the depression, all right, they'll soon be into bargaining. Actually, it may feel like that. And if any of you have been bereaved, you will be familiar with this messy, squiggled diagram. I know that that's certainly how it felt when my dad died. And actually my dad is here today in the form of a memory bear that my friend made me out of his clothes. So that's why he's sat right at the front. So yes, it's more, it definitely feels more like this. So there isn't that linear approach. And we often think of bereavement in the immediacy of the death, and I touched on that earlier on. And whilst it's crucial the bereaved child has support at this stage, it's also really important to think about the long-term ongoing grief. And we think of it in the early days, but it shouldn't be underestimated that grief isn't something which just fades over time or something we get over, but is something we learn to live alongside and build our lives around. And you might be familiar with Tonkin. This was actually drawn by the sister of the girl that I talked about who died at 10 years old. I really wanted her voice in this book. And she very beautifully drew the balls in the jars. And it's not that the ball shrinks, the ball stays the same, but the jar, or our life, expands around it. Yeah? So that's growing around grief. And in fact, it was Lois Tonkin in 1996 came up with this, and the original one looked more like a fried egg. She was exploring the reality of life after death of her child. So the yolk was the grief, and then the white she thought would get, you know, bigger and bigger around the outside. And another theorist we talk about, this was drawn by one of my nephews, actually. The other nephew did also draw one. I didn't want arguments. So this is lovely. And this was from a Twitter user who talked about a ball in a box and the pain button. And again, it really resonated with me that in the immediate aftermath of a death, that ball is constantly hitting that pain button. It has very little other place to go but the pain button. And over time, in her model, the ball gets smaller, so hits the pain button less often. I combine Herschel's diagram with Tonkin's and say, isn't that the ball gets smaller, but the box gets bigger, and therefore it hits the pain button less frequently. And then we have Strobe and Schutt. Again, this is discussed in a lot more detail in one of Poppy's further chapters. But this really helped me when, after my dad died, I kept thinking, oh, I thought I was doing well. I thought I was, moving away from this awful feeling of grief and sadness. And now I've gone backwards. And you haven't gone backwards. You are hopping between the two sides all the time. It's how we cope. It is painful, it is uncomfortable, so we don't always want to be in that lost focus. We move between the two. And as I said, when I felt like I was going backwards, it's very easy then for a teacher to think, oh, they're over it now, it's been a week, they'll be all right, they've moved on from their grief. But actually, no, we will constantly go back and forth. And it can be confusing not only for the grieving person, but as I say, for the teachers as well. And they can be swamped with difficult emotions at what seems like just a normal task, and then all of a sudden feels like an insurmountable challenge. And that is where I really love the Child Bereavement UK's idea of puddle jumping, which they're going to talk a bit more about and actually show us a little animation, which makes it really clear. And that was from my other nephew. So yeah, both of them got to contribute to the book. So in our book, we explore loss, grief and bereavement, the way that we experience death of a loved one, which Marie touched on, stages of grief, how children understand death and different perspectives. And we ask questions about what can we learn from special schools, what can we learn from hospice, and it's lovely to see Marion Barton here today who contributed to that chapter, or with your colleagues, wasn't it, Marion? So yeah, the team contributed, so thank you. And also, as Poppy just said, how we can support minority groups. And we share the guidance, as Annalisa said, we share guidance on writing a bereavement policy. We share lived experiences of grief and bereavement from mostly adults who are looking back at their childhood, who have been bereaved as a child. The really important chapter on looking after yourself, because it is a tough topic to deal with and it can trigger your own emotions. So really good self-care techniques, not only for use actually when dealing with bereavement, but just in life. There's some really good tips in there, but particularly when you're dealing with a challenging topic. And then there is the resource bank of practical activities that Emma Marfleet, can't see you Emma, right at the back, has written for us. We chose 4 core texts and she's written some really lovely activities. And Annalisa's report that you showed right at the beginning, that's another really rich resource that schools can use to support everybody in understanding what bereavement is. So I'd highly recommend using that too. Reflections bags. You may have noticed that there are some little black drawstring bags, and there are, I don't know if everybody will manage to get one today, quite possibly, but what we wanted to do is give a little thank you for coming along, and they're little physical tokens, tiny tokens to honour the past, as we said, and offer comfort for the path ahead. So the reason that those items are in there is the drink to soothe your raw emotions, the bubbles to steady the breathing, a little key ring there, it says storms don't last forever, some forget-me-not seeds that you can plant, and I have to mention, I brought him with me, Buddy Bear. Now again, Emma, the little girl whose sister died at 10, wrote me the most beautiful letter, and I feel myself getting emotional, when my dad died. She knew how it felt. And she wrote me this gorgeous letter explaining that my dad still loved me and it would be hard, but I would get through it. And she brought me Buddy Bear. I call him that because Dad had to have chemotherapy, and he called his bottle of chemotherapy his buddy that he had to have for a day. And she brought me this bear, and he's got a wonky head and he's got stitching in his leg because for a year he lived in my pocket, came with me to school, came with me on difficult occasions, and I wanted to make sure he came with me today because it really helped me, And that's why we've put the little heart-shaped pebbles in our bags, so that it's a token for children to hold on to and know that that person, sorry, I can see people wiping tears and I didn't want to do that, but it really touched me the way that she got it and she wanted to do something for me. So please help yourself to a reflections bag and use those with the children that you work with, or have them for yourselves. And of course, I have to mention that you can get 20% off the book. Moving swiftly on, we have got some copies at the back today. So if you would like to buy one today, that's lovely. But if you would like to buy it later on, you can also use the code there. So thank you very much. And I will hand over to Lorna Weiss. Thank you.